Derek Chauvin's conviction in the US throws into sharp relief the situation here in Australia. Dr Hannah McGlade is an experienced legal academic and human rights expert with special interest in Indigenous human rights, and she joins us now from Perth. Hannah McGlade, welcome. First of all, what was your reaction when you heard this news just in the last couple of hours?
Oh, great relief, I think, and it is the right verdict. It is the just verdict. We've seen leadership from the jury, but also from the President and his deputy. This is a very important moment in the history of not just the United States, but the world, actually.
Why do you say the world?
Well, the world is watching. We watched when George Floyd was killed in this horrific manner. 9 minutes by a police officer in full view of everyone, captured on a smartphone. And we watched as America erupted into righteous anger because of the lack of safety for African American people, the killing of innocent African American people. And we know that's an issue in Australia. We've had many Aboriginal people die at the hands of police and also in prison custodies. So we are seeing leadership now from President Joe Biden and his deputy. This is a very historic moment. It's an opportunity for racial transformation in the United States and also in Australia. I think that this is very clear. We have many people here supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and equality for Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, in those comments from Joe Biden, we just heard him say this type of conviction was all too rare. How does it contrast with the experience here in Australia for Indigenous people?
Well, very similar. We haven't had a murder conviction of any serving police officer. Aboriginal people were very disappointed after the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody some 30 years ago now. Not one officer was held responsible for any of those deaths. And we know that some of them have been absolutely horrific and that police and prison officers have most certainly been involved and are responsible. But there hasn't been justice in this country, and that is a fundamental blight on our nation because it's absolutely critical principle in our legal system that we're equal before the law. Well, we haven't seen that to date. Now, we have 2 serving police officers who are charged with murder of Aboriginal people, and these are going to be also challenges for our nation.
Yeah. And so how do you think the position of Indigenous Australians compares to that of African Americans in the US in terms of how they're treated in the justice systems? It's been examined extensively in the US and exposed extensively in the US, but do you believe Indigenous people in Australia are possibly in an even worse position?
It certainly is as serious. The rate of incarceration here does reach that of the United States, and particularly in regards to Aboriginal women. We have a former Chief Justice in West Australia who thought that Aboriginal women here were the most incarcerated group of people in the world. And he had looked at the incarceration for the US. And we know that there is a very high risk of Aboriginal people dying in custody. The risk for every Aboriginal person is 10 times that for a non-Indigenous person. But what we're seeing in America now is more recognition of systemic racism and the need to transform this absolutely wrongful situation that is costing too many people's lives. We need to see that kind of commitment in Australia. The evidence and the research certainly is there, which shows that racial profiling is happening. It is well and truly happening in our country, and it's not being addressed because we're not facing up to our legacy, which is continuing to this day of racism and human rights violations.
And so how does Australia practically face up to that legacy as you describe it?
Well, we need to see the leadership from our governments, and I'm referring to both the federal and state governments. There is a call at the moment from families of Aboriginal people who have died in custody to meet with the Prime Minister. I encourage him to do that and to take inspiration from President Biden, who certainly did meet with George Floyd's family and quoted his daughter in his speech today to the nation. That, understanding that, what happened had changed the world. We need to see that sort of change and that racial transformation in Australia. And we have still unimplemented recommendations from the Royal Commission some 30 years ago, and also the Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry only 3 years ago, which haven't been responded to by the current governments. And they need to do better and remember that they have to respect the Indigenous people's human rights, and we cannot continue along this track of disregarding First Nations people in this country.
And as someone working in this field, do you take inspiration from what has happened in the US in the last couple of hours?
Yes, most certainly. We've seen truth, justice and healing, I think, happen, the potential for it to change the course of the history in the United States today, to see a president looking at these important issues to tackle systemic racism in the justice system with his deputy, the first woman of colour in that position, an amazing person. They're looking at policing transformation laws. This is so inspirational. This should be guiding Australia now in our domestic affairs and race relations. We've had 5 deaths of Aboriginal people in custody in less than a month, and it is time for change. We need to change policing. We need to wipe out racism in our policing, and we certainly do need to make sure that we stop incarcerating and treating so cruelly Aboriginal people in regards to the criminal justice system and the incarceration that is really a blight on this nation.
Okay, Hannah McGlade, thanks so much for talking to us this morning from Perth.
Thank you.